October the 7th, 1981, Red Square, Moscow. The Soviet Union at the height of its power. 64 years after the great socialist October Revolution, Moscow has become the center of world communism and the second superpower next to the United States. In 1991, tanks are once again rolling through the streets of Moscow, but this time they're aimed at the Russian parliament. The old-style communist faction of the party wants to put an end to Gorbachev's reform policies. But the people of Moscow fight back. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation to have been elected in free elections, is standing on an armored tank appealing to the people that they resist the tanks of the putschists. The putsch fails. And with it, the greatest political and social experiment of the 20th century. Yeltsin offers hope for a new post-Gorbachev policy after the demise of the empire. Does the end of the Soviet Union also mean the end of the communist idea? An idea that has captured the imagination of people all over the world for decades. How can one explain the collapse of the communist system, the fall from world power to political nothingness?
The system was incapable of reforming itself. That is the heart of the matter. The reason lies in Gorbachev's precipitous experiments. I have no doubt about that.
I think the notion of creating a perfect society by going counter to human nature is dead. Because the basic error of communism was that it simply did not understand human nature.
The Soviet system failed because of its absurd notion of mankind, which could not meet the challenges of modernization through industry and information technology. Even the bureaucrats no longer believed in the system. The party people became increasingly cynical and corrupt, and acted merely by rote and without moral vigor.
President Reagan was in the right time, in the right place, and he found dead bear, and he told, I killed them.
Some people came to power who never should have, who had nothing to do with fulfilling the communist idea.
Communism as an ideology was emancipatory, and as a system of government, oppressive.
The myth of the October Revolution. The storming of the Winter Palace, seat of government, on October the 25th, 1917, according to the Russian Gregorian calendar. Legend and reality. The famous film director, Sergei Eisenstein, staged the dramatic events with powerful images. In his film, October, the revolutionary masses, led by Lenin, stormed the palace. Their goal, to depose the corrupt government. But in reality, Lenin wasn't there. The famous film was propaganda. The truth looked entirely different.
Suddenly the Bolsheviks, after a rebellion that most of the population hadn't noticed, that was the night when bridges and banks and everything else were taken over. And on the next morning, the Bolsheviks were in power.
On the morning after the coup, the palace was besieged by curious bystanders. There was little damage, just a few broken windows.
No art objects at the Winter Palace were destroyed. Everything in the wine cellar was destroyed, so that the Red Guard could... They drank all these wines. 200 or 100 years old. Cognacs and everything was broken. What a shame.
This was done by several hundred members of the Red Guard and sailors under the command of Leon Trotsky. First evidence of his talents as a strategist.
Trotsky, der Urheber des Stadtstreiches.
Trotsky, who initiated the coup, once said that a disciplined and loyal regiment would have been sufficient to thwart the coup, but there was no such regiment.
The big winner of the Bolshevist October Revolution is Lenin. His uncompromising will to power helped him prevail within his own party and then in Russia as a whole. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born in 1870 in rural Simbirsk, the son of a school inspector. His mother, a nobleman's daughter, is an enlightened Democrat, and she passes these ideals on to her children. Vladimir displays talent and extraordinary intelligence as a pupil. When his brother Alexander is executed in 1887 for participating in a failed assassination attempt on the Tsar, Vladimir too chooses a revolutionary path. A few years later, he assumes the nom de guerre, Lenin.
If you look at our leaders, from Lenin to Putin, they all came from the working class, peasants, or from workers with a higher education. All except Lenin himself, and that is crucial. Lenin hailed from nobility, and is thus entwined with both the old and the new. Lenin's attitude towards Russian autocracy hardly differed from that of the radical faction of the so-called Russian revolutionary intelligentsia. For them, the Tsarist regime was the embodiment of evil.
Für die revolutionäre Intelligenzia verkörperte das zarische Regime das Böse.
Tsar Nicholas II rules a country stretching from Warsaw to Vladivostok, an autocratic monarch who answers only to God and himself, his allies the nobility, who have divided the country up amongst themselves, a small but immensely wealthy upper class. Russia is an agrarian society. 80% of its 135 million inhabitants work in agriculture. Serfdom of peasants is abolished in 1861, making them free citizens, but they still don't own the land. Compared with peasants, there are only a few industrial workers, 3 million. Many peasants flee from rural poverty to the big cities. In the few factories in St. Petersburg, Moscow and Minsk, they toil for starvation wages, often 18 hours a day. The people live under the most inhumane conditions, deracinated, thrown together in mass housing. The Tsarist regime resists any attempts to democratize it. Political parties were outlawed until 1905, and their members persecuted, arrested and imprisoned. Thousands were incarcerated or banished.
The more backward a country is, the greater the likelihood of violent protest actions, and the stronger the pressure exerted by the state, the police and the military in a society, the less likely that the goals of the socialist movements could be achieved through democratic means.
It was a vision of forging a civitas without exploiters. A totally egalitarian society where only workers exist. And the exploiters are degraded to second-class citizens.
The more pragmatic Western society transform Marxism into social democracy inside that. The Russian mentality want to implement all the things just like you read it in the book.
In November 1895, Lenin founds the Revolutionary League for the Liberation of the Working Class. Accused of political agitation, he's banished to Siberia in 1897. Here he marries the revolutionary Nadezhda Krupskaya. After his banishment, Lenin leaves Russia to go into exile. A brilliant theorist and born orator, Lenin becomes leader of the radical wing of the Russian Social Democrats. Because his wing manages to win a party assembly vote by a slim majority, he gives his faction the name Bolsheviki, which means majority holders. The democratic parliamentarian-oriented wing, which is actually larger, gets the name Mensheviki, or minority holders. The Bolsheviki uncompromisingly advocate the dictatorship of the proletariat.
The assumption is that mankind is good. Thus, as opposed to conservative or liberal beliefs, mankind doesn't need any checks and balances, any control. And that is communism's basic fallacy, also with Lenin, which led to the unchecked power that was inherent in Bolshevism from the beginning.
It was supposed to be a party of professional revolutionaries, a firmly disciplined, centralized party which was to assume the role of avant-garde of the working class. This conception, which marked an incredible rupture in the history of the Marxist movement, was revolutionary.
The basic premise is people do not know what is good for them. An elite, scientific method must find out objectively what is good for the people. Subjectivity isn't relevant here.
Summer 1914. The assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne brings the international tension to breaking point. Russia mobilizes its troops. Germany declares war. While living in exile, Lenin believes that the outbreak of the First World War is a historical necessity and signals the impending end of capitalism. The hardships of war intensify the economic and political tension in Russia. The masses protest against hunger, the war, the government, and the Tsar. Nicholas II is forced to abdicate after the February Revolution. A provisional government is formed, and all over the country, worker and soldier councils, the Soviets. The irreconcilable differences between the parliamentarian bourgeois government of Kerensky and the radical Soviets hinder finding solutions to urgent problems. While war is raging in most of Europe, Lenin, exiled in Zurich, formulates his radical program. He rejects a parliamentary republic and in his famous April Theses demands the elimination of the provisional government and the assumption of power by the Soviets. The reaction of Lenin's comrades in Russia to his theses is unenthusiastic.
Man war damals der Meinung, Lenin habe aufgrund seines langjährigen Exils die russische
One thought back then that Lenin's long exile didn't allow him an accurate grasp of the Russian reality, that he'd even lost touch with it. Solidarity of all democratic revolutionary forces was the order of the day.
Revolutionären Kräfte.
You have to remember, Lenin jumped in the revolution in the middle of this. He was not the person who really started this, initiated the revolution. At that time he lived in Switzerland, drank beer and discussed the German economy.
Lenin realizes that he must return to Russia to spearhead the movement. His goals are an immediate armistice and a major land reform. He seeks the support of the masses. The German imperial government offers Lenin and other exiled revolutionaries freedom of passage. The exiles travel across Germany in a sealed train carriage. Lenin's return to St. Petersburg is supposed to destabilize Germany's war enemy, Russia. Revolution in Russia, an opportunity for the German Supreme Military Command to successfully end the war on the Eastern Front.
Lenin's griffige Parole.
Lenin's catchy slogan, "End the imperialistic war now," and his other slogan, "Rob what was robbed from you." He incited the peasants to confiscate the property of the landowners. These slogans had an enormous effect on Russian peasantry and on the Russian lower class. And Lenin adapted himself to the mood of the Russian underclasses.
Lenin is greeted enthusiastically by his followers when he arrives on April the 16th, 1917. The next day, he gives his programmatic speech before a Bolshevist party assembly. The bourgeois February Revolution must be followed by the socialist revolution in Russia. He enforces this decision, an armed rebellion with the objective of seizing power. In May 1917, Leon Trotsky returns to Russia. He too had been active in the working class movement in the late 19th century, was banished to Siberia because of his underground activities, and lived in exile for many years after fleeing. He and Lenin demanded the overthrow of the provisional government, as well as world revolution. Trotsky organizes the storming of the Winter Palace, has the provisional government arrested, and helps Lenin and the Bolsheviks gain power.
They had gained power in one of the most backward countries in the world, 140 million inhabitants, an agrarian society, very few industrial workers, an 80% illiteracy rate. The whole country was in ruins, destroyed by 3 years of World War I. And now the revolutionaries were faced with the contradiction of wanting to build a new socialist society, the contradiction between striving for an ideal and reality.
Immediately after the victory of the revolution, the new government, the Council of People's Commissars, put Lenin's plans into practice. First of all, Lenin offered the Germans an immediate armistice. In the spirit of world revolution, German and Russian soldiers fraternize. Lenin's other plan, the land reform, is also implemented immediately. Because the peasant soldiers want to return home, the army is dissolved. The big land estates are expropriated without compensation, surveyed and given to landless peasants. The old dream of Russian peasantry comes true. Millions of peasants become landowners.
Einerseits war natürlich die marxistische.
On the one hand, Marx's doctrine was very important for Lenin. And Marx's doctrine stipulates that this land shall be nationalized. On the other hand, Lenin had a keen sense of what the agrarian population wanted, unlike many dogmatic Marxists, even in the Bolshevist party. And he knew that the nationalization of land immediately, that this measure would make the peasantry so angry and reject the system. So he wanted to put this issue on hold for a bit.
Wollte ein bisschen warten.
Lenin was a smart man. He had to realize that Russia wasn't a developed industrial country like Germany or England or even Belgium or France. Russia was an agrarian country with a relatively small population of industrial workers. One couldn't build a revolution only on the workers in Moscow and Petrograd. And so that was his contribution to revolutionary theory. And his great student was maybe not Stalin, but Mao.
For the new landowners, Lenin is a hero. They believe in a better future and celebrate the socialist revolution. For the leading theorist of the German Social Democrats, Karl Kautsky, this is willfully misleading.
According to Kautsky, what Lenin and his followers were planning in Russia and carried out in 1917 was not a proletarian revolution and not the first great socialist revolution, but the last bourgeois revolution.
Marx and Engels
said in the Communist Manifesto that the Communist program can be summarized in one sentence: the abolition of private property.
Die Abschaffung des Privateigentums.
According to Karl Marx, the private ownership of the means of production is to be nationalized. The bourgeois society can only be overcome through the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the eyes of radical socialists, Lenin is not a Marxist.
More than 90% of the arable land in Russia was in the hands of peasants at the time of the Civil War. So one could say that he was a dogmatic Marxist, but a flexible one.
Even more radically, one could ask, was Marx a Marxist? Isaac Berlin once wrote, if Marx rose from the grave, he'd say, and above all, I am not a Marxist. For Lenin, it wasn't just a tough ideological struggle, it was also linked to his utter disdain for the people who believed in those ideas. Although Lenin almost never used harsh words against his opponents. No, he was calm and matter-of-fact. His entire hatred and disdain was directed against liberals and social democrats, although they should be much closer to him than his true opponents.
On November the 25th, 1917, there are the first free elections in Russia. For the first time in history, women have equal suffrage. The winner is the party of the social revolutionaries. The Bolsheviks receive only 1/4 of the votes. Lenin feels that his power is jeopardized, and in December founds the National Secret Police, the Cheka.
The Bolsheviks, like all left-of-centre parties, fought under the Tsarist regime for a constitutional assembly resulting from free elections with secret ballots. Finally, in November 1917, such elections did take place, and in early January 1918, the Constitutional Assembly met. And then it became clear that 70% of its members were a peasant party.
When the delegates of the Constitutional Assembly vote in their first meeting on January the 18th, 1918, against all power being transferred to the Soviets, Lenin leaves the room. It was the last meeting the Bolsheviks allowed.
And then, on Lenin's orders, the meeting was disrupted and dissolved.
The next day, Lenin has the gates locked and the delegates arrested. This marks the end of democracy in Russia after just one day.
After the
violent dissolution of the Constitutional Assembly, the Bolsheviks refuted the democratic principle of adapting to the will of the majority. And this means that they could govern this majority, who rejected them, only with force and dictatorial means.
At Lubyanka Square in Moscow's center, the Cheka sets up shop. The first chief of secret police of the Soviet regime is Felix Dzerzhinsky, a confidant of Lenin. Under Dzerzhinsky's direction, the Cheka becomes the most important instrument for maintaining power.
The Cheka, the secret police, fought not only opponents of the revolution, but mostly Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. Those supporters of the revolution who weren't Bolsheviks.
Lenin was not in favor of ruining rule of law. He said, socialist democracy is bourgeois democracy without the bourgeoisie. Socialist culture is the continuation of bourgeois culture without the bourgeoisie, etc., etc. The socialist state is the continuation of the bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie, without exploitation, etc., etc.
Lenin
and Dzerzhinsky had a huge state apparatus at their disposal to fight what they called the irrationality of the masses.
The prisons from Tsarist times were not enough to hold all the prisoners captured by the Cheka. Only 3 months after the October Revolution, dissidents are sent to forced labor camps, making relatives as well as perpetrators culpable. Isolation confinement, torture and murder are the means used by the secret police to, as Dzerzhinsky says, save the revolution.
This is
an attempt to adapt reality to the utopia, a utopia which is removed from reality, and this reality rebels. So one attempts to adapt this reality by force. That's why I would say that this attempt inevitably led to terror, because it's impossible to create a social paradise on earth.
If you want to create paradise on earth, doesn't that justify it? A little terror here and there, if the end result is paradise.
The Bolsheviks proudly call their bloody procedure Red Terror. In the famous decree on the Red Terror, it says, in the current situation, it is necessary to secure the heartland through terror. To protect the Soviet Republic from class enemies, they will be isolated in concentration camps. Persons involved in White Guard organizations, conspiracies and revolts will be shot.
Glorifying this red terror and needing to rationalize it, I think these are on the one hand remnants of the thinking during World War I, and on the other they stem from the idea that only by force can we implement a better way. The term socialist terror is a contradiction in itself. It paved the way for many things that were later put into practice under Stalin. The end justifies the means, doesn't it? And as one can see with Lenin's pronounced advocacy of terror, it didn't only start with Stalin.
The Bolshevik government is threatened from both within and from abroad. The armistice with Germany mobilizes the other war opponents. Britain, France and America send troops to Russia. In southern Russia, the Cossacks revolt. They allied themselves with the other formerly Tsarist troop contingents to form the so-called White Armies.
Die Weißen Armeen verkörperten
For the majority of the Russian population, the peasants and the workers who rejected Bolshevism, the White Armies represented the old regime. The same old regime that would reinstate the class system that the Bolsheviks had abolished in October 1917.
Lenin commissions Trotsky to establish a Red Army of workers and peasants. Bloody conflict rages all over the country. Villages are burned to the ground, people are killed, and the government secures its own power through terror. Prisoners are shot. Lenin calls for the Red Army to resist.
Капиталисты Англии, Америки, Франции ведут войну против России. Они помогают деньгами и военными припасами русским помещикам.
In the summer of 1918, the Red Army is in retreat and the revolution is in jeopardy. Lenin hopes for support from Germany.
And then this massive goal they set for themselves. We're on the eve of world revolution. It's unfortunate that we're doing this now in Moscow, but there's no doubt, says Trotsky, that in a few weeks we'll be holding our Comintern conferences in Berlin, Paris and London. What optimism!
Einen unglaublichen Optimismus.
And here, too, in the United States, there were big industrial strikes and riots, adjustment problems, economic and social adjustment after the war. And our elites back then were very, very afraid that such revolutionary currents could reach us as well.
Angst, dass es bei uns so eine Art revolutionäre Strömungen kommen. Die Bolschewiki haben
The Bolsheviks gained power in Russia for the purpose of igniting a world revolution.
Die Weltrevolution auszulösen.
So they thought that the World War, which had shattered the existing capitalist order, was a unique opportunity for the proletarian parties to abolish the capitalist order once and for all. The actual victory of the proletarian revolution was to be in the West, according to Lenin.
Im hochindustrialisierten Westen stattfinden.
After the lost war, revolution comes to Germany. The SPD splinters into the Independent and Majority Social Democrats, the USPD, and the revolutionary Spartacist League, which models itself on the Russian Revolution. In this recording, SPD delegate and President of Parliament Philipp Scheidemann reports on this day.
Already on the morning of November the 9th, 1918, the Reichstag looked like an army camp. Workers and soldiers went in and out, many carried weapons. Ebert and I sat with some other friends hungrily in the dining hall. As usual, just thin water-like soup was served. Then a group of workers and soldiers stormed the hall and went directly to our table. 50 people screamed at once. Scheidemann, come with us. Philip, you must come out and speak. Liebknecht wants to declare a Soviet republic. What? The situation became clear to me. Germany is a Russian province, a Soviet branch. No, 1,000 times no. I saw the Russian madness before me, the Tsarist reign of terror replaced by a Bolshevist one. No, no, not that in Germany, on top of all the other suffering.
To preempt Karl Liebknecht, Philipp Scheidemann declares Germany to be a democratic republic.
Nothing must happen that dishonours the workers' movement. Be unified and faithful and honour your duties. The old and rotten monarchy has collapsed. Long live the new. Long live the German Republic.
Among Marx and Engels' political heirs, a fraternal struggle ensues. While Scheidemann's majority Social Democrats choose the path to parliamentary democracy, the radical left fights for the Soviet or Workers' Council system. All power to the Workers' Councils was the slogan of the Spartacus League, founded in 1916 by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg.
Ich glaube, dass die Rosa Luxemburg,
I believe that Rosa Luxemburg was such a, I'll say, fundamentalist Democrat, that she had to reject anything that would impair democratic development, because it would lead to despotism.
ablehnen musste, weil sie sagt, das führt zu einer Willkürherrschaft.
Rosa Luxemburg was, I believe, the only revolutionary figure in Europe who could rival Lenin.
Lenin hätte trotzen können.
And he might have even accepted it.
Born and raised in Poland, Rosa Luxemburg has been living in Berlin since 1899 and become the leading politician of the German left. In 1918, she co-founded the Communist Party. She increasingly criticizes the militant left and also the great leaders of the Russian Revolution.
Sie hatte auch beobachtet, dass Lenin selbst nicht zimperlich war mit Gegnern. Allerdings muss ich sagen,
she had also observed that Lenin pulled no punches when fighting opponents. However, I must say that despite Bolshevism's foresight, if you look at her theoretical underpinnings, and especially the famous sentence about freedom always being the freedom of those who think differently, then you notice that what she thought and wanted wasn't as liberal and pluralistic as it seemed on first appearance. In her writings there are funny and interesting passages that say the deciding majority doesn't always have to be a quantitative one. Now savour that one. So Rosa Luxemburg did have a keen sense of power issues.
Auch Rosa Luxemburg hatte durchaus Sinn für die Machtfrage.
She saw the great danger that minority action would end in catastrophe. But on the other hand, she, who seemingly had faith in the spontaneity of the masses, was no longer able to contradict mass action once it happened. And that's how she justified the Spartacus revolt, an action she hadn't wanted.
Revolutionary sailors hoist the red flag on the Brandenburg Gate. The Spartacus League believes, like its great role model Lenin, that the time is right for revolt, and on January the 6th, 1919, declares that the provisional German government has been deposed.
A civil war, as Rosa Luxemburg imagined, should it have broken out in Germany, would not have remained restricted to Germany alone, but have mobilized the Allies. That meant prolonging the World War. And that was irresponsible in the view of the governing Social Democrats, the worst possible case imaginable.
The government's troops were supported in the fight against the rebels by the Free Corps, volunteer troops who formed after the dissolution of the Imperial Army. The revolt is suppressed with much carnage. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg are arrested and then murdered by members of the Free Corps.
If the advocates of the revolutionary class struggle hadn't splintered from the social democratic establishment, and if the social democratic establishment had adhered to the dogma of class struggle and to rigorous rejection of any cooperation with the bourgeois parties, then the parliamentary democracy, called the Weimar Republic, would never have existed. Then the majority faction of Social Democrats would have been incapable of doing what they had to do in order to ensure democratic development in Germany, namely working together with moderate bourgeois parties. This division of the workers' movement during the First World War was both prerequisite and millstone for the Weimar Republic.
On January the 19th, 1918, the Constitutional Congress of the Weimar Republic is elected. The winners are the bourgeois parties. Germany is now a parliamentary democracy and federal republic. A revolution, according to the Russian model, has failed. In Russia, the civil war continues. But while the poorly organized White Army is losing ground, the Red Army is advancing. Leon Trotsky built an army of 5 million soldiers. In his famous armored train, he travels to precarious battlegrounds and reinforces discipline. Deserters are shot immediately. Soviet troops beat the White Armies and their foreign allies across the board. On December the 13th, 1919, the Allies decide to no longer support the White Armies. The Red Army marches to victory. The Civil War has a gruesome aftermath. Red commissars are sent out to confiscate food for the army. The peasants revolt. They no longer tend their fields. And before they let the supplies be taken away, they set their own barns on fire. Russia experiences the worst famine in its history. Over 5 million people die. Lenin and his Bolshevists have won the Civil War. The power struggle is settled, and Russia is the only country in which the communist revolution is victorious.
All other communists were in small parties. Not many. Once in a while they revolted. Between 1919 and 1924 there were about 40 revolts, all of them suppressed. And the Russian communists, they did it. That was right at the beginning. A true willingness to let the Russian communists take the lead. In July 1920, the Second Congress of the Communist International takes place in Moscow. The world revolution can only succeed, Lenin claims, if the policy and actions of all communist parties are controlled centrally from Moscow. In that respect, the Communist Party of Russia, as it now calls itself, is generous. It was an open secret that there were very few communist parties that had enough money to independently finance their activities. Everything else was done by Moscow, by the instructors who came with and distributed the money, so that it would be invested to the maximum benefit of Comintern and the Soviet government. Every functionary knew that he was getting the money from Moscow. A massive propaganda campaign hopes to win over the people for communism. Party workers were sent to the country in special trains to teach the people how to read and write. And they also advertised their idea. After oppression and exploitation in the past, the proletariat would now assume leadership. In the factories, workers would decide. The profit system would be abolished. Apartment houses, hospitals and schools would be built. From now on, everything would be done for the benefit of the people. And it will be the communists who will lead the way into this glorious future.
The education of the people was undertaken systematically and on a large scale, based on higher humanist ideals. One must take into account that the development level of our society and our state was not very high at the time, if one may say that. We were just beginning to emancipate ourselves from the darkness, lawlessness and illiteracy that was the legacy of Tsarist Russia. 76% of the population was illiterate, By the early 1940s, we'd achieved a literacy rate of almost 100%. We brought culture and knowledge to the people, raised its intellect, not just that of a few, but of the entire population. At the same time, of course, there was also an element of intimidating those who still believed in the old order and who had a different conception of state power.
Using the same method with which they won the Civil War, the Bolsheviks want to rebuild the country. This system is known as war communism and is based upon the mandatory delivery by peasants, upon nationalization and forced labor, or militarization of labor as Trotsky calls it. But there is resistance all over the country.
The war communism system, the Russian reality, was forced through boundless terror to adapt itself to doctrine. This attempt failed, not least because the majority of the population after the Civil War had been won could no longer bear the Bolshevist reign of terror.
Die bolschewistische Terrorherrschaft nicht weiter dulden konnte.
In January 1921, workers in Petrograd go on strike. The government responds with martial law and arbitrary mass arrests. On February the 28th, 1921, 16,000 sailors joined the striking workers. They appeal to the people, the time has come to sweep away the autocratic commissars. All power to the Soviets, no power for the party. The strikers demand an end to oppression, to terror and to arrests. They demand that the freedoms gained in the revolution be reinstated, together with free elections with secret ballots, freedom of speech and other parties.
The Kronstadt sailors were the most ardent advocates of the revolution, and they were always praised by the Bolshevist leadership as a bastion of the revolution. But then the sailors turned away from the autocratic leadership, which crushed the democratic impulses and structures.
Von der Zerschlagung der demokratischen Regungen, der demokratischen Strukturen im Lande abgewendet.
On Lenin's order, the Red Army advances across the Baltic Sea ice to attack on March the 7th. After 11 days and harsh struggles, the sailor insurrection is brutally crushed.
Die Niederschlagung des Aufstandes der Kronstadter Matrosen.
The crushing of the Kronstadt sailor rebellion revealed the true nature of the Bolshevist regime, because the Kronstadt sailors fought the Bolshevist dictatorship in the name of Soviet democracy.
Gegen die bolschewistische Diktatur im Namen der Sowjetdemokratie.
The first loss of innocence, the first political mortal sin, was doubtlessly the crushing of the Kronstadt rebellion, because then they went after their own people, after the young soldiers who'd supported the revolution, but now weren't convenient for whatever reason. If one was capable of that, then one was also capable of other things, as became evident later.
Trotsky watches the parade celebrating the victory of the Kronstadt sailors. Many were able to flee to Finland, but whoever fell into Bolsheviks' hands became victims of merciless revenge. In the first show trials of the young Soviet Republic, thousands are sentenced to death or long prison terms. Fast-track communism has failed. Failure to meet the population's basic needs, with famine spreading and an uprising in Kronstadt, clear signs of crisis. Lenin needs to change course. Just as his land redistribution in 1917 violates Marxist principles, Lenin is about to make an economic U-turn with noticeably capitalistic underpinnings.
He was the believer in the pure scientific Karl Marx theory that in reality was a utopia. But it was only until 1921. In 1921, Lenin reversed the Soviet policy. He returned to the allowing of the new economical policies, the private ownership, and he told it serious and for long. And he had very strong opposition among his followers, and Trotsky and Stalin and many others.
Das war die Legitimierung.
It basically legitimized the idea of a free market and private property, both of which were the bête noire of orthodox Marxists. For this reason, many Bolshevik functionaries and Bolshevik idealists felt that the new economic policy was a tremendous setback.
Die neue ökonomische Politik als einen ungeheuren Rückschlag empfunden.
Lenin attempts to save the country's economy at the 10th Party Conference. His new economic policies, NEP for short, are extremely controversial. Even his closest allies greet his policies with scathing ridicule. After heated debate, Lenin succeeds in pushing through a governmental resolution. Within the party, varying factions will no longer be tolerated. Opposition means exclusion. Dictatorship now begins within the Communist Party itself. The Russian economy recovers. Optimism is in the air. Fishermen and farmers sell goods at the marketplace. Money can now buy things and becomes an incentive to work.
Even at the height of the new economic policy, the standard of living in the Soviet Union and in Russia itself reached a historic high.
The stock market and the banks reopen. The new ruble is minted. Lenin goes so far as to invite Western capitalists to invest in Russia to help roll back the country's economic deficits. We must grant concessions to the foreign bourgeoisie and outside capital, were Lenin's words to the Third Communist International. But many comrades are convinced that Lenin's new economy will betray the basic principles of the revolution.
And what was Stalin's reaction to these proposals at the time? That they were the product of a sick mind. Gorbachev, who was a party functionary at the time, suggested that Lenin's decree, which had been published in Pravda, should be reissued in a special edition just for Lenin himself, since no one else needed to know about them.
In May 1922, Lenin's health deteriorates dramatically. He suffers his first stroke. 2 more would follow. Lenin withdraws from governmental activities. From this point on, he resides on a country estate near the city of Gorky. Leon Trotsky appears to be Lenin's uncontested successor, an intellectual with more charisma than any other Bolshevik leader and a popular commissioner who was victorious during the war. Lenin, however, was still alive, and his successor had not yet been decided. And Trotsky had stiff competition. Joseph Stalin, the Communist Party's General Secretary.
Lenin was a genius of theory and practice, while Stalin was a genius of practice and theory. But Stalin was also a master criminal. He understood the role information plays. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin can be mentioned in one breath. Their teachings were truly of epochal significance, but not because they were eternally valid, or for every era, but only for that particular historical period.
Lenin was like a craftsman when ferreting out political enemies so that he might destroy them. But one could say Stalin turned that concept into an industry.
The difference between Lenin and his followers like Gaidar, then after 4 years Lenin understood it's enough, it's not working. And after that I don't think that he was a real Marxist. He became a statesman and the Russian political leader.
Along with the majority of thinking people in the Soviet Union, I believed that everything would be fine as long as Lenin was still alive. The great catastrophe supposedly didn't begin until after Lenin's death. My opinion of Lenin is more generous than most people's these days. The tendency is to try to take down Lenin along with Stalin. I consider that highly unfair from a historical perspective. Lenin acted in the heat of revolution and civil war. Under Lenin, the Communist Party played the dominant role over all other organizations. The Cheka. There were a number of dictatorial elements which were the foundation upon which Stalin could later build.
Ganz diktatorischen Elementen, auf die Stalin nachher aufbauen konnte.
Alle Elemente des Stalinismus.
It's important to realize that the germ of Stalinism is inherent in Leninism.
Das ist die wichtige Feststellung. Bei einer anderen
Under a different leader, the development of events may have taken a different course, but not one that would have led to democratic communism.
Hin zu einem, sagen wir mal, demokratischen Kommunismus.
That seems to me to be, as Leszek Kolakowski put it so well, like frying snowballs.
Gebratener Schneebälle.
Certainly, Lenin wouldn't have approved of events that were to come. And without a doubt, this was secretly discussed in Soviet times, if Lenin had been alive, he would have been convicted in one of the show trials that took place in the years between 1936 and 1938.
Lenin dies on January the 21st, 1924. The whole country is in mourning. Stalin arranges the burial. In a telegram to Trotsky, he gives a false date to keep the competition from attending the funeral. In his political testament, Lenin warned against the ambitious Stalin, but it was already too late. Within the span of 2 years as party general secretary, he replaced 16,000 functionaries. Another bloody chapter of Russian history begins. Moscow, June the 24th, 1945. Soviet troops assemble at a victory parade for their wartime leader, Joseph Stalin. Communism has defeated fascism in the Great Patriotic War. Flags and army banners once belonging to the fallen enemy lie at the General Secretary's feet.
Stalin war auch ein Erbe der Zaren.
Tsarism was part of Stalin's heritage, right? Somehow, if you take a look at his foreign policy towards the Balkan states, the similarities to Tsarist imperial foreign policy are startling. There was a very interesting episode. Ambassador Harriman, the famous Avril Harriman, ambassador to Moscow at the end of the Second World War, greets Stalin at the Potsdam Conference in Sicilienhof and says, "Marshal Stalin, you must be very happy to be here, standing in the capital city of your enemy as victor." Harriman reported that Stalin answered with, "Tsar Alexander made it all the way to Paris."
Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili was born in Georgia in 1879. He grew up in humble circumstances, the son of a shoemaker. His mother wants him to become a priest. An intelligent pupil, he receives a scholarship to the seminary in Tbilisi, the only institution for higher learning in Georgia. A social democrat since 1898, he's imprisoned and ostracized for revolutionary activities. Stalin, the man of steel as he now calls himself, joins the Bolsheviks and is voted into the Central Committee at Lenin's request in 1912. After the February Revolution of 1917, he returns from exile and takes on the post of editor-in-chief of Pravda, the party newspaper.
He understood the value of information. It's not the position that makes you powerful, that gives power, but information. In the beginning was the word.
After the October Revolution, Lenin appoints the shy Georgian to the post of People's Commissar for Nationalities Affairs. Lenin believes that the chaotic after-effects of the First World War will cause the bourgeois governments in Europe to collapse under the pressure of the international proletariat. But a world revolution didn't happen. Civil war rages in Russia. The Bolsheviks, led by War Commissar Leon Trotsky, emerge victorious. Russia is now the only country to be ruled by communists. After Lenin suffers his first stroke in 1922, Trotsky reviews the parade celebrating the 5th anniversary of the October Revolution. Although Trotsky is now treated as Lenin's successor, Stalin has begun a struggle for power.
Stalin was in the second tier of the revolution's leadership, a power-hungry apparatchik who used bureaucratic backdoors, intrigue, terror, threats and corruption to get power and to keep it.
Of course, nobody could foresee who will be Stalin. I don't think that Lenin saw, yes, Stalin was dangerous.
The Communist Party chiefs gather around Lenin's casket. Only one of them is missing, Leon Trotsky. Stalin sends Trotsky the wrong burial date to prevent him from attending the funeral services. Stalin carries the casket along with his comrades Zinoviev and Kamenev. The triumvirate has a common goal. They want to divide Lenin's power among themselves.
After
the Bolsheviks failed to bring about the proletarian revolution around the world, the Bolshevik Party was desperate for a new vision, and Stalin provided one.
There are historical situations where it's not necessarily the most clever, not necessarily the one with the most foresight, but the person who says, with something like fanatical obsession, "I know the way, comrades."
Stalin was now saying, we're strong enough to expand socialism on our own. And with that, Stalin appealed to Bolshevik national pride. Establish socialism in one country, in Russia, is his slogan. The market-oriented economics brought about by Lenin's new economic policy is incompatible with Stalin's communist vision. His goal is a classless society with the means of production held by the state. About 1926-25, Stalin called the new economic policy into question and then abolished it. He abolished the alcohol prohibition that Nicholas II put into effect in 1914, and that was even upheld in spite of the Civil War until about 1926. Then Stalin said, a drunk man doesn't care about politics.
Der getrunkene Mann denkt nicht an die Politik.
Stalin war ein relativ beschränkter, was seine theoretischen Begabungen.
Stalin's theoretical abilities were relatively limited, which helps explain why he was scorned by any number of Bolshevik theorists. What Stalin and Lenin had in common was an extraordinary feel for the spirit of the times they lived in.
Für den jeweiligen Zeitgeist.
The first thing he did was push Leon Trotsky, a believer in world revolution, out of his official posts for leaning too far left of the party line. Then Stalin turned against his one-time comrades. Zinoviev and Kamenev were stripped of their power. Kamenev was returned to grace and to his posts only after a show of humiliating self-criticism.
Stalin appealed to
the democratic and egalitarian tendencies within the new party base. As he said at the 15th Bolshevik Party Congress in December of 1927, we don't need nobility in the party. Stalin has Trotsky, his most dangerous opponent, imprisoned and, in the finest Tsarist tradition, exiled to Siberia. Following that, he had adherents of Lenin's new economic policy discredited as right-wing dissidents and removed from power.
Stalin
was a very precise and focused politician when it came to his political and personal positions of power. And a huge country was subjected to these power interests of his. The leading representatives of the Stalinist faction were not merely instruments of Stalin's power, they were his comrades in spirit. And it was with their help that he was able to execute this unprecedented revolution from above. With the presentation of the first five-year plan, the project of building socialism in one country has begun. Stalin dedicates the party to developing heavy industry and to collectivizing agriculture. His principle, everything for the country, nothing for the individual. There is no room for open dissent. Whoever goes against the party line is an enemy of the people.
Imagine, Stalin holds a speech, then divides the country into 3 great territories. The first has to be totally collectivized by the spring of 1931, the others to follow by the spring of 1932. And then there are a few left behind. We'll give those time until 1933. He was the one who precisely determined what all the farmers were to do at what time. With an appalling, this collectivization was absolutely brutal.
Accompanied by a massive propaganda effort, private farmers are forced into state-run farm collectives known as kolkhozes. The collectivization reverses Leninist policy, which encouraged the farmers to take possession of property belonging to large estate owners with the slogan, "Take back what was stolen." Lenin's way of winning farmers over into the revolutionary fold. Now Stalin is taking land away from them again. Prosperous farmers, the so-called kulaks, are declared to be enemies of the people. Many of them are executed. Others are driven out of the country or deported. Collectivization degenerates into a war of terror against the peasants, lasting several years and leading to catastrophe. In the Ukraine alone, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, over 4 million people starved to death by the early 1930s.
Many Bolshevik leaders, and many of Stalin's comrades, were of the opinion that now that this top-down revolution had been accomplished, now that the farmers were expropriated, the goal of the system had been reached, and socialism had been implemented in Russia. The farmers having lost their property, and the collectives, the kolkhozes, having been set up, that now it was time to develop the planned economy phase. Meaning now the entire population would be involved in the economy. They believed that the goal had been achieved, and so it was no coincidence that the first party congress that took place after collectivization had been accomplished. That was the 17th Congress in January 1934, known as the Victors' Party Congress. In other words, the victors over the Russian farming community.
The 17th Party Congress of 1934 was the Party Congress of the victors, and the communists wanted to celebrate their successes. Collectivization of agricultural economics was accomplished. Industrialization was making good progress. Stalin's statement of accounts was applauded. A political discussion, however, doesn't materialize. Among the 1,200 delegates is also the young Nikita Khrushchev.
My father talked about Stalin all the time. Stalin was a very charismatic person. He just infected all the people who were there. My father talked about Stalin negatively. Mikoyan talked about Stalin all the time. Other people like Molotov talk about him positively, but all of them, until last days, talk about Stalin.
Stalin thinks that all the delegates support him, but his brutal policies have repulsed many. During the secret Central Committee vote, 300 delegates crossed him off the list, while Sergei Kirov, party chief from Leningrad, achieved the best results by receiving only 3 no votes. He was enthusiastically cheered. Stalin could not accept that and saw to it that the ballots against him disappeared. Seemingly unmoved, Stalin poses for photographs with the delegates. But his deadly distrust has been awakened. A short time later, Kirov is shot dead by an assassin.
70% of the Central Committee members who voted for the Victors' Congress were murdered by Stalin in the next 3 to 4 years.
Lubyanka, the seat of the secret police, becomes the center of terror. Thousands disappear forever behind its gates. In show trials, Stalin's former allies like Kamenev and Zinoviev and many opponents within the party are publicly accused, forced to confess and sentenced to death before cheering crowds.
So now the party fell victim to the same terror that had been used against the country's non-Bolshevik elements and groups.
Mexico, 1937. Leon Trotsky, expelled from Russia by Stalin for being a capitalist spy, attacks the show trials in Moscow.
There are no crime in history more terrible in intention or execution than the Moscow trials of Zinoviev Kamenev and Radek Petakov. These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism, that is, from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people. A counter-trial is necessary to cleanse the atmosphere of the germs of deceit, calumny, falsification, and frame-ups whose source is Stalin's police, the GPU, which has fallen to the level of the Nazi Gestapo.
But Stalin's arm has a long reach. In August 1940, Leon Trotsky is murdered in his Mexican residence. Millions are shot in the Soviet Union. There are purges in the entire country.
It is the answer how my father survived Stalin, the same as you will go somewhere and meet the person after the earthquake and ask how you survived earthquake. By chance, because he was lucky, nothing else.
In
1937, I helped my father to clean his library, as it was called back then. My father and I brought baskets full of books by Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev and others who'd fallen out of favour to burn them in the cellar oven.
Ofen im Keller unseres Hauses zu verbrennen. Und
every day we expected the people to come. Father will be taken away and disappear.
Abgeführt und verschwindet.
A simple denunciation is enough to have someone condemned. The Gulag, a system of huge prison camps, is established. Anyone can fall prey to the arbitrary punishment. The oppression silences any resistance. Stalin's terror will cost millions of lives.
It was truly an evil empire in which the individual was nothing. Not only those who resisted the system and didn't agree with something, but also those who were totally devoted to this system. The whole Leninist Guard was destroyed. Everyone.
The internal opposition in the Soviet Union was almost completely eradicated in the 1930s. Physically destroyed, either shot on the spot or murdered in the Gulag.
In prison, high-ranking military officers were standing next to me. Party workers, local and district secretaries, NKVD staff members. There was no professional group who'd not ended up at this construction site. Nobody paid attention to how many people died, how they were fed or clothed. Nobody was interested. If someone managed to survive for as long as he could, that's how it was. It was a political struggle. We wanted to build a unified society, and upon this foundation, solve the most pressing external and internal problems of our state. But then the question arose, how shall we proceed? Hundreds of thousands of prisoners needed employment, a basis for living, and so we started the big projects.
Stalin discovers that the prisoners' labour is an economic factor. Forced labourers are used for major projects like the construction of the White Sea Canal, building the Siberian Railway, or mining for gold in Magadan.
After 1937, when millions of enemies of the people were taken away, it was decided that they should work. Firstly, we needed gold, and secondly, the people were supposed to drop dead. In winter, there was no beating. If someone could no longer work, then he was not beaten and left alone. But his coat was taken away. He must work, otherwise he will freeze to death.
Впереди меня один, я не знаю, кто это был, он споткнулся о пенек.
Someone walking ahead stumbled. I didn't know him. We were walking through the tundra, then he fell, out of line, off to the left. Immediately a machine gunner came and shot him on the spot. Then dogs ravaged him. It was terrible. But we were used to that. I never gave up, and that's why I made it.
Despite the all-pervading terror, Stalin's reputation remains unblemished.
But the prisoners believed until the end that Stalin had nothing to do with it, that he'd been deceived, that it was all just imperialist propaganda, with the express goal of deceiving Stalin and the government. Our great scientists, who played a very significant role in our economic development, always spoke of Stalin with great respect, although many of them had been arrested under harsh conditions and still did research. They understood that Stalin did all of that only to solve problems. They always spoke highly of him.
First of all, there was the opinion that it couldn't have been that bad. It was an anomaly. Secondly, maybe there really were criminals and spies at work. And thirdly, once he's liberated himself from that, then maybe things will get better. Many parts of Europe weren't so horrified about Stalin's methods. Firstly, because they didn't believe in the existence of the gulags, and secondly, because they themselves lived and fought under civil war-like conditions, this time for the right cause.
In Russian tyranny, all these reformers were tyrants. You look in the Ivan the Terrible and Ivan the Fourth. He reformed Russia, but he killed half of Russian population. You look in the more contemporary Peter the Great, Peter the First. He is one of the reformers. He built this window to the west, but he reduced Russian population 1/3, and he's still a great reformer. So Stalin, with his 60 million or 50 million of Russians who perished through his so-called reforms, maybe one on this line.
1938. Stalin's internal enemies have been vanquished. Public criticism has been silenced.
Чтобы они были свободны от всякой паники, от всякого подобия паники. Когда дело начинает осложняться, и на горизонте вырисовывается кое-какая опасность, какая бы она ни была. Чтобы они были также свободны от всякого подобия паники, как Ленин.
With unprecedented severity, Stalin has imposed a radical new form of society upon the Soviet Union. Stalin declares that communism, the crowning form of society, has been achieved. But his vision goes even further. Because, according to Marxist teachings, being shapes consciousness, he sets out to create the new socialist man.
Especially young intellectuals are fascinated by radicalism and even a certain brutality. And this radical and brutal side of communism, that we would change everything all at once and find the great solution. That was fascinating, I think. I was still very young, 18 years old, had just graduated from high school a year early because Adolf Hitler needed soldiers. And then I almost became a communist. I had a friend, a sailor, older than me. He'd seen the world, a grown-up, and I was still an adolescent boy. And under this influence, and in opposition to the Nazis, I almost became a communist. I didn't know what communism really was, but I was very attracted to the idea of absolute equality. But that was just a phase.
The idea of absolute equality was fascinating, and Stalin cleverly used this. Parades celebrate the romanticized image of happy people in the workers' and peasant state. The new man should be selfless, work until exhaustion, committed to the communist ideals. And above all is Joseph Stalin.
Communism wanted the new man, and undertook a huge experiment over decades to find out if this was possible. It referred to old ideas in doing so, and in the end, the result is that the new man cannot be bred. But this anthropological optimism, that one can make a new man, that is, I think, at the core of communism's failure.
Man kann einen neuen Menschen machen, ist, glaube ich, der Kern des Scheiterns der kommunistischen Ideologie.
It was officially declared that Marxism-Leninism is not a political theory, but a science. The science of laws and patterns determining countries and peoples in the past, present and future. Laws, not opinions. This claim to being a scientific ideology with laws and patterns, and the detailed way in which this was presented, starting with dialectic materialism and the psychologically so interesting phenomenon, differing from all non-communist beliefs.
Und der psychologisch so interessanten Erscheinungsform, dass im Unterschied zu allen nicht-kommunistischen Auffassungen
Synthesis, cooperation, collaboration, negative. The history of mankind is determined by conflict, struggle, and contradiction.
Intellectuals from all over the world are invited to the All-Union Congress of Writers in Moscow. They're committed to achieving a more just world. Maxim Gorky holds the keynote speech. In his eyes, the capitalist West is rotten, and the future belongs to communism. He puts himself in the service of Stalinist propaganda without any qualms. The international artists give the conference glamour and the regime legitimacy.
Es gab natürlich auch die Illusion.
Of course, there was this illusion. It could never be that bad in the workers' fatherland, because it wanted and was able to offer an alternative to the degenerate, decaying Western society.
Degenerierende Gesellschaft setzen wollte und konnte.
So there was a plethora of varying hopes, ideas, comments, expectations, which led to astonishingly smart people to no, the other way around. Astonishingly intelligent people proved that intelligence and smartness do not have to be identical.
Intelligente Leute bewiesen haben, dass Intelligenz und Klugheit nicht identisch sein müssen.
The Russians were good at creating facades, wonderful facades with nothing behind them. And so they received George Bernard Shaw there, and he came home and said, "Famine? Never heard of it. I've never eaten so much as when I was there."
The German author Leon Feuchtwanger, like many intellectuals, is wary of democracy and lets himself be blinded by Stalin's policy. Propaganda in Russian newsreels.
The first impression was that he is unusually unpretentious. Stalin has humour and is receptible to it. One can understand why the masses not just adore, but also love him. He is part of them. the legitimate representative of the 170 million people of the Soviet Union. Even a poet could have not conceived a better one.
Wie ihn sich der Dichter nicht würdiger ausdenken könnte.
If you grew up in the Soviet Union and came to the West, everybody started talking about stability. Stability. Getting all worked up. Crisis. I said, why are you so worried? That's normal. Crisis is normal. Stability is the exception. Very seldom and very insignificant. Thus, an entirely different relationship developed to historical and contemporary phenomena, and a belief that only the Marxists and Leninists have this insight. This goes beyond the current situation, and this played a big role, especially for writers, poets, and what is often forgotten, natural scientists. Those who also started talking about scientific Marxism-Leninism.
Ich würde doch ein bisschen tiefer zurückgehen.
I'd go a bit further back.
Man kann auch das ganze 20.
One could read the entire 20th century as a quest to answer this question.
Eine Suche
What comes after
nach
Christianity?
einer Antwort auf der Frage, was machen wir nach dem Christentum?
Where will we find our
Wo finden wir
post-Christian
unsere
utopias?
Utopien.
And communism was an image of paradise on earth.
Und der Kommunismus war ein Bild des Himmels auf Erde.
The USA, 1929, the stock market crash. The economy collapses. Mass unemployment drives large parts of the population below the poverty line. Many people put their hopes into the ideas of communism.
The Great Depression from 30 to 33 gave many intellectuals the impression that capitalism was collapsing and wouldn't recover.
Bricht zusammen. Und das schaffen die nicht mehr. Und dann,
But in the Soviet Union, they were building.
die Weltwirtschaftskrise hat
The depression made it much easier to succumb to the Soviet myth.
dem Sowjetmythos hinzugeben.
The command economy in the Soviet Union is not affected by the crisis. Stalin's 5-year plan is successful. Major industrial combines are formed. Thousands of engineers and skilled workers from all over Europe and the US volunteer to help build the Soviet Union. They're not afraid of the communist dictatorship of the proletariat.
I first developed my political awareness in the late 1930s, in a large socialist state, namely New York. And one could say that some of the intellectuals knew very well that Stalin was a tyrant, and that he used socialism to justify the incredible concentration of power, the exploitative use of it, and the tyranny and murder in the gulags.
Ungeheuer Machtkonzentration, Machtausbeutung und Tyrannie und Mord in den Gulags. Auf der anderen Seite,
on the other hand, many people unconsciously admitted this, but said, yes, but Russia, the Soviet Union, are the only defense against fascism.
Wir machen uns heutzutage etwas vor, indem wir meinen, dass die sogenannte
We're deluding ourselves by claiming that the so-called Western world had always been dominant.
Es ist doch so, in der
It's
ersten
like
Hälfte
this.
des 20. Jahrhunderts
In the first half of the 20th century, most Europeans believed in other value systems, be it fascism or
sei
communism.
der Faschismus,
Only about, let's say, a third believed in the values of liberal democracy.
hat an den
So all of Europe was pursuing other utopias, so to speak.
Also ganz Europa war sozusagen auf der Suche nach anderen Utopien.
In Germany, that is Hitler's doctrine of the superiority of the Aryan race. After seizing power, the National Socialists persecute everybody who is different or thinks differently to the point of extermination.
There was apparently only one power strong enough to beat fascism,
dem Faschismus die Stirne zu bieten.
and that was the Soviet Union under Stalin.
Sowjetunion Stalins.
And I have many memories. This always recurs. Yes, I don't like a lot of what's going on in the Soviet Union, but it seems to be the only power which can save us from Nazi victory in Europe.
Spain, 1936. A leftist People's Front government has won the elections. Civil war then breaks out. Right-wing forces ally themselves with General Franco's fascists, supported by the German Condor Legion and Italian troops. The Republican government turns to Stalin for help. He sends commissars but no weapons. International brigades with volunteers from all over the world fight for the Republic. But thanks to the use of state-of-the-art weaponry and foreign troops, General Franco's fascists emerge victorious. The socialists and the international brigades are forced to flee.
Stalin, he was not a communist, but an anti-communist. For him, the reaction of the communist world was a secondary issue.
Stalin, throughout the considerable period of communist development in which he ruled, actually regarded foreign communists with suspicion or disdain.
Stalin destroyed 3 times as many communists as Hitler.
The Spanish Civil War at first seemed to confirm that these two totalitarian systems that have sought each other out, communism and National Socialism, would always fight each other to the death.
The defeat in Spain had no significance for Stalin's strategy. He's afraid of being encircled by a coalition between Germany, Italy and Japan. He looks for a way out.
After all his attempts to forge an alliance with the British and the French against Nazi aggression had failed, Stalin sees no other way to avert war except the non-aggression pact with Germany.
Den Krieg in die Ferne zu lenken, so glaubte als ein Nichtangriffspakt mit Deutschland.
According to all the new documents at our disposal, Stalin had the idea essentially, it's impossible to say for certain, to stay out of this world war which he knew was looming as long as possible, and maybe even be the one to benefit when it's over.
Sich rauszuhalten und vielleicht hinterher dann der lachende Dritte zu sein.
In August 1939, Foreign Minister Ribbentrop flies to Moscow on Hitler's orders. The two mightiest dictators in Europe sign a non-aggression pact. Hitler wants to free his back for an attack on Western Europe. In a secret agreement, they divide Poland between them. Hitler also lets Stalin have the Baltic states. In the Soviet Union, anti-fascist propaganda is discontinued.
For 3 days and 3 nights, the libraries were closed. You went there, but weren't let into the reading room. Secret, closed. In these 3 days, all anti-fascist books were removed from all Soviet libraries and put into secret storage places. Were no longer lent out.
On September the 1st, Germany attacks Poland. 17 days later, Soviet troops also march into Poland and the Baltic states. The German army occupies almost all of Western Europe, but there is peace in Moscow. Stalin's plan seems to have worked. But only seemingly. On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union begins. In November, German troops are at the gates of Moscow. Stalin declares the Great Patriotic War. The Germans are beaten at an enormous cost. 27 million lives are lost.
And then we won the war, that most terrible war, a war that decided not only the Soviet Union's fate, but also that of the world, especially Europe. We survived the war and made progress, although at a tremendous cost. We lost 90% of the young men born in 1921, 22, 23. 90% of these young men were killed.
90% Männer aus diesen Jahrgängen sind umgekommen.
Yalta, February 1945, the Big Three Conference. Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin discuss what should happen after Germany is defeated.
At Yalta, Europe wasn't centre stage, but the American and British desire to involve the Russians in the war against Japan. For that, they were willing to pay a high price. For Roosevelt, who was the American leader in Yalta, this price meant he was willing to accept that Europeans, continental Europeans, would live literally under Soviet domination for the next 300 years.
Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill divide Germany into occupation zones. Poland becomes a Soviet satellite, and the border agreed in the Hitler-Stalin Pact is confirmed. Thus, Britain did not achieve its goal of the war, an independent Poland.
After Yalta, the mood became deeply pessimistic. After Yalta, Churchill knew that the war had been lost.
Roosevelt promised Stalin a loan of $4 to $5 billion after the war, etc., etc. But what did we get? In March 1945, April 1945, it had already been set up. Churchill began his Operation Unthinkable, war against the Soviet Union immediately after the end of World War II.
Krieg gegen die Sowjetunion sofort nach Beendigung des Zweiten Weltkrieges.
Soon, allies become embittered enemies. Europe is divided.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Stalin's
post-war program was not to build up socialist states in Eastern Europe. Not Sovietization of these states, and certainly no mention of marching to the Atlantic coast.
Marsch zur Atlantikküste.
Neither Stalin nor the Red Army had the strength to march on, to make a significant advance, especially since American supplies, trucks, gasoline and whatever else that was necessary were not being delivered. But Stalin did have a vision of Russia, or the Soviet Union, as the only power on the continent.
Our intelligence services received initial information from reliable sources, as they say, about plans for nuclear war against the Soviet Union in the fall of 1945.
At first, democratic parties were allowed in the countries occupied by the Soviet Union, as agreed in the Treaty of Yalta. Stalin declared that each country could choose its own path to socialism.
It was supposed to look democratic, while actually having a tight grip on everything, the classical cadre policy. There were a number of resistance movements, in Poland, the Ukraine, still active for many years in the wilderness. They had enough arms, but by 1949 these movements had all been wiped out.
The Yugoslavian party leader and partisan hero Josip Broz, known as Tito, chooses his own path to socialism. The Yugoslav people cheer when he breaks with the Soviet Union in 1948. The unity of communism has been broken. From now on, Moscow is no longer the spokesperson for all communists. China, 1949. After 3 years of civil war, Mao Zedong declares a People's Republic. 32 years after the Great Russian October Revolution, the Communists are victorious in the world's most populous nation. Mao Zedong, from a family of peasants and a teacher by training, co-founds the Communist Party of China in 1921. He believes that the rural proletariat forms the core of the revolutionary masses. Following Lenin's example, he wins over the peasants by expropriating the owners of big estates. Right after seizing power, the communists commence transforming Chinese society.
They completely transformed the administrative structure in line with the Soviet model. The entire structure of the party as well, of course, so the Communist Party of China was built as practically a carbon copy of the Soviet model.
Mao had very strong similarity with Stalin, and he knew this.
Mao travels to Moscow for Stalin's 70th birthday. Here, the two most powerful men of the communist bloc meet. Their subjects form almost 1/2 of the world's population. Two dictators who nurture a cult of personality and pursue their goals by force and through terror.
During the Stalin era, there were repression and executions of innocent people. But at the same time, our country experienced an incredible boom. It became a superpower, successfully industrialized the economy and collectivized agriculture. It was a tremendous revolution which helped to advance our country.
Stalin was not an effective leader because through his purges, from his executions, he destroyed so many of the real productive people that it was counterproductive to the country.
Stalinism was really a ruthless self-destruction of talent. And in the process, it almost became a norm in the Soviet system and by extension in the systems that were imitating the Soviet system to promote people who were fundamentally inferior, who were not creative, who were obsequious, who were opportunistic, and who, to put it very simply, were fairly stupid.
On March the 5th, 1953, Stalin dies. Hundreds of thousands of grieving mourners pay their last respects. His successors and rivals for his throne gather around his casket. Stalin's longtime personal secretary, Georgy Malenkov, the party secretary, Nikita Khrushchev, and the powerful Secret Service head, Lavrenti Beria, who already 3 days after Stalin's death orders the release of 1.2 million Gulag prisoners. The power struggle for Stalin's succession has begun. After Stalin's death, everyone is expecting change. Berlin, June 1953. The supply situation in the GDR is critical. There are rumors that the party General Secretary Walter Ulbricht will be replaced.
We followed the advice that Comrade Stalin gave us.
When Ulbricht raises the labor norms, the construction workers at the Stalin Allee site in East Berlin take to the streets. The protests all over the country turn into a national revolt. The protesters storm party offices and demand free elections. Ulbricht asked the Soviet military for help.
Each country have their own mythology. German mythology about these events, that it was a revolution. In reality, and from my father's understanding, it was the strike, economical strike, against some wrongdoings. Secondary, from his opinion, it was the German problem. And when Soviets put their tanks on the crossroads, everything calmed down.
Soviet tanks crushed the rebellion. In Moscow, those rivaling for power exploit this incident for their political aims. They blame Secret Service head Beria for the revolt. In December 1953, Beria is shot dead. In 1955, Malenkov is stripped of his powers. 3 years after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev has maneuvered himself into a favorable position. At the 20th Party Congress in 1956, he takes another considerable risk. In a spectacular speech, he denounces Stalin's crimes. This is tantamount to blasphemy. But his risk pays off. He manages to convince the delegates.
When Khrushchev held his speech, everybody was naturally shocked because no one knew the extent of repression. And also imagine that the 20th Party Congress was prepared by a man who himself took an active part in the repression. He was personally responsible for thousands of victims. How could one expect objectivity from someone like that?
I will say that 70% it was emotional. It came from his soul and his heart, because he believed that we are building the best society on the world. It will be communism, where the people live like in the heaven.
The delegates sing the Internationale. They have chosen their new leader, who will lead them into a new and better world. The expectations for Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev are high. Although Khrushchev's speech is not published, its message quickly spreads around the world. The communist parties in the satellite states follow Moscow's example and practice public self-criticism. In Poland, crowds take to the streets to demonstrate for democracy. They force the reinstatement of party chief Gomulka, who had been arrested under Stalin. Khrushchev's trip to Poland can't prevent this.
He provoked Gomulka to make his statement. We will not quit Soviet bloc. We are interested in the presence of the Soviet military in our territory. Khrushchev told, we have a deal, and they became friends.
The Hungarians demonstrate out of solidarity with Poland. They also demand freedom and democracy. The demonstrators first clash with the Hungarian police, then with occupying Soviet forces. The Hungarian army joins the revolt. For a few days, Soviet tanks clear Budapest. The new government under Imre Nagy leaves the Warsaw Pact and declares Hungary's neutrality. For Khrushchev, this is a counter-revolutionary putsch he can't allow.
It was freedom fighters, the ordinary people who fought for their freedom, of course, but behind them were the strong anti-Soviet forces. It was two powers who played this power game, and it was the ordinary people who paid their toll.
With the superior might of Soviet tanks, Khrushchev crushes the revolt. In desperation, Hungary appeals to the United Nations for help, but nothing happens beyond the passing of some resolutions. Khrushchev has reaffirmed his power. Convinced that the communist system is superior, he sets out to win the struggle against capitalism. Baikonur, October the 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union placed the first satellite into orbit around the Earth. They called it Sputnik. Quiet beeping from outer space alarms the Western world, which fears that rockets used to launch a satellite could transport atomic bombs. 1961, the next warning bell. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man in space. To Nikita Khrushchev, this demonstrates the superiority of communism.
Khrushchev believed in the communism the same as the Christian believed in the heaven. He told that we can build most effective society.
Nikita Khrushchev was born in 1894 into a poor peasant family in the Ukraine. His grandparents were serfs. A machinist, he joined the Communist Party in 1918. After his studies at the party academy, his career advanced quickly under Stalin. As Moscow's party secretary, Khrushchev made a name for himself overseeing the construction of the subway system, which was completed in record time. He participates in Stalinist terror and joins the heart of power, the Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, in 1939. As the party's political commissar with a general's rank, he played an important role in the battle for Stalingrad during the Second World War. When Stalin dies in March 1953, Khrushchev, who is a member of all party organs, wins the battle to become his successor.
Khrushchev was not so Russian type of the person. If you want to be the leader like Mao or Stalin, You mustn't talk. You have to appear once a year, say something that nobody would understand, and then everybody will discuss what you really had in mind, because you're much wiser than others.
At the 20th Party Congress in 1956, Khrushchev surprises everyone by denouncing Stalin's crimes.
Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were rehabilitated and released from the Gulag archipelago. The second part of Khrushchev's revolution was his refusal to partake in the boundless exploitation of his own people. Stalin believed that the Soviet people should primarily produce and not consume. Consuming was considered bourgeois. Khrushchev legitimized consumption.
Nikita Khrushchev wants to improve the general standard of living. He sees to it that production is increased in all segments. Everywhere, new fields are being cultivated for agricultural use. Khrushchev intends not only to meet American standards, but to exceed them. Communist corn is at least double the size of capitalist corn.
He told the Americans in one of his speech, "You are ahead of us, you are more effective. We will learn everything from you, and then we'll be effective, and after that, or you will join us, or we'll say goodbye to you."
Khrushchev was gifted by nature. He had a fantastic memory and could grasp what was going on very quickly. But Khrushchev was a good example of how absolute power absolutely corrupts a politician.
Vienna, June 1961. The world's two most powerful men make a glamorous appearance. The young, newly elected American President John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Party and governmental chief, meet for the first time. Demoralized by the failed Cuban Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy's attitude is reserved. Khrushchev takes the offensive and repeats his demand that the Western Allies retreat from Berlin. Only 2 months after the summit meeting in Vienna, construction of the Berlin Wall begins on August the 13th, 1961. The gap in the Iron Curtain that allowed people in their thousands to escape to the West every day is closed off.
The building of the Berlin Wall, of course, it was defeat for the system. Because the wall, they show that you cannot protect yourself, that show that you are not attractive to the people.
The elite had simply already left by 1961. If they hadn't closed off that escape route, everyone else would have left as well, which would have been intolerable, because they still believed in building such a socialist state. That's why they built the wall. It can't be justified, but it did fit into the logic of that particular communist experiment.
The West didn't attack. Khrushchev continues on his confrontation course. He supports a number of liberation movements and presents himself as leader of the Third World. Khrushchev uses the UN as a political forum. The American boycott policy drives Cuba into the communist corner.
Khrushchev is good friend, good Cuban friend. Your leaders speak about aggression to Cuba. Khrushchev speak about defending Cuba. You to take our plane. Khrushchev plane is our plane. Khrushchev is friend.
So Khrushchev wanted to be respected as equal. And he pressed all American presidents, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy. It was one of the reasons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I want to be equal. And Americans didn't want to do it voluntarily, so they just did it under the pressure from the Khrushchev.
In October 1962, American spy planes photograph missile sites in Cuba. Kennedy imposes a naval blockade. The crisis escalates. Both sides prepare for nuclear war. The world is on the verge of annihilation. At the last minute, Kennedy and Khrushchev succeed in reaching a secret agreement. Soviet ships carrying missiles reverse course. In return, America agrees to remove their nuclear missiles from the Soviet-Turkish border within 6 months. dangerous silence between the two leaders is overcome by the installation of a telex line, the famous hotline. The world's most powerful figures are once again playing peaceful games. Here Nikita Khrushchev plays badminton with the American Secretary of State Dean Rusk. But the economic race with the West has failed. Khrushchev acknowledges that a centrally controlled economy is too unwieldy. His ambitious land reclamation projects were unsuccessful. After a series of crop failures, Khrushchev is forced to purchase wheat from the capitalist enemy.
He lost face. I don't mean Khrushchev personally lost face, but the Soviet Union did. Many fellow party members in the so-called people's democracies felt the same, and I think it was one of the reasons he was deposed relatively easily.
He started at that time the new round of reforms. He wanted to decentralize it and to give the most of the power to the directors and reduce their relations with the state only with paying taxes. It will be could be first step to the market economy.
Engineers, factories in the Soviet Union, impossible. This idea of centralized planning, where we were supposed to plan things down to the last detail, was completely ludicrous. We were expected to become autonomous, and that wasn't possible. Add to that the incompetent party officials. We needed experts at that point. Trying to make plans when basic figures are in the tens of billions. How could anyone do that? Those who talked about far-reaching economic reform, not necessarily just privatization, but other things as well, and without which the Soviet economy would go bankrupt.
And all this bureaucracy was against this because they understood that they would control this, and they wanted stability. Stability in the understanding that they will sit in their chair until they would die, what happened during. So they wanted him to be replaced.
In honor of his 70th birthday in April 1964, Nikita Khrushchev is awarded the country's highest decoration, Hero of the Soviet Union. The decoration ceremony is carried out by Leonid Brezhnev, who is also concurrently planning an overthrow. Only 6 months later, in October 1964, the time had come. Khrushchev is ousted from power.
He was driven out of office by the old Stalinists, or neo-Stalinists, the bureaucrats and the privileged, because he wanted to go too far. The Soviet Union was a class society and not interested in sacrificing its privileges.
Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev is the new strong leader. Born in 1906 in the Ukraine as the son of a steel worker, he completes the classic route to becoming a party official. After Khrushchev is overthrown, he becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party. Brezhnev rehabilitates Stalin and guarantees posts and privileges. His power is based on the party machine and the military. He rearms and expands the Soviet military presence in Africa and Asia. In Vietnam, Brezhnev supports the communist Viet Cong against the invasion by American troops. The war in Vietnam, the American carpet bombing and the high loss of Vietnamese civilians lead to protest worldwide. Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara and Fidel Castro became symbols of the student protest against the Vietnam War and the capitalist system. They begin reading Marx and Engels and believe in a socialist future.
They felt sympathetic to the cause of the Third World, but most of all had a yearning for change, movement, new experiences, new intellectual horizons. And that's why they didn't refer to Marxism, but to early Marxism, or the romantic conception of Marx.
It
was a phenomenon for me. I was young then. I couldn't quite understand how anyone living in West Berlin, only a few kilometers from the GDR, could still believe in Marxism or even communism.
Und noch gläubiger Marxist sein, ja, oder gar gläubiger Kommunist.
Am besten ist gekennzeichnet wird die 68.
The 1968 student movement is best characterized by their own slogan, "Don't trust anyone over 30," which made it clear that this was a revolt against their parents' generation.
Gegen die Elterngeneration gehandelt hat.
They weren't communists. They were just plain foolish.
We are not hopeless pawns of history incapable of taking destiny into our own hands. We can shape the world in a way that they've never seen before. A world that doesn't know what war is, that abolishes hunger and abolishes it around the globe. This is our historic chance, and we should just drop out. I'm not a career politician, but we're people who don't want the world to go this way, and that's what our struggle is about.
We were living in a society that was totally ossified, with all the important organizations entrenched in this rigid post-war society. And by that I mean that all the parties were cosily established, and the academic youth in Warsaw, or in Berlin, or Frankfurt didn't want to conform to that. We wanted change. Of course, we had no idea that the changes would take 30 years, and that wouldn't take place on the capitalist side, but on the post-Stalinist side. In the end, a lot of what we called for back then has come true, but it didn't happen in the West, it happened in the East.
In Czechoslovakia, too, people dream of a freer and more just society. The Prague Spring becomes a symbol of socialism with a human face. Alexander Dubček's democratic reforms are greeted with enthusiasm by the Czechoslovakians. In July 1968, Leonid Brezhnev comes to Bratislava for a Warsaw Pact meeting and demands that the Czechoslovakian comrades return to the Soviet path of socialism.
The Soviet leadership rigorously fought any attempt of the satellite states, that's how they were called back then, to disassociate from the bloc, or tolerate anything which could jeopardize communism as a pure doctrine.
The Brezhnev, who was against any reforms, and he was scared that if something changed, it will affect the Soviet Union, he tried to freeze the things.
August the 21st, 1968, Warsaw Pact troops march into Prague. The Czechoslovakian government condemns the invasion as a violation of international law, but nevertheless tells the army and the people not to resist. But the people stand up to the tanks. The Prague Spring is ended in violence. In retrospect, the Soviet Union justifies its actions with the Brezhnev Doctrine, the common duty of all Warsaw Pact members to defend socialism.
After the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia in '68, I wrote actually publicly that this is the beginning of the end of the Soviet system, because it meant that it was now a system based entirely on military force and bureaucratic suppression.
One should never forget, although many do today, that the Soviet Union had a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons. This means that criticism of the West's failure to intervene in such terrible crimes can only be countered by the conviction that it would have led to world war and the death of millions of people.
There was a danger, and we all lived with an awareness of that danger. And it was terribly important to maintain a posture, a military posture, which would not give the Soviet leaders even the remotest degree of confidence that they could win a nuclear war.
Both superpowers have the nuclear arms capacity to destroy the world several times over. Neither country can attack the other without risking its own downfall. This overabundance of arms is called the balance of terror and is supposed to guarantee peace during the Cold War. The greatest concentration of arms is in the two German states, the likely nuclear battlefield. The new German government under Willy Brandt explores possibilities of overcoming the confrontation of systems.
Der Kommunismus ruht auf zwei Pfeilen.
Communism is based on two pillars. The first is military might, tanks and missiles. The second is ideology, the means to keep the whole thing from falling apart.
Den ganzen Laden zusammenzuhalten.
So if you want to do something about the Soviet system, you have to make sure that the first pillar is or will be no longer dangerous.
Gefährlich ist
meaning arms reduction, restriction, and arms elimination to reduce or eliminate the threat factor.
Sodass der Bedrohungsfaktor reduziert oder ausgeschaltet wird. Und der zweite Faktor,
and the second factor, ideology, is something only the Social Democrats could take care of. So that was the hypothesis on which we operated.
Wir im Einzelnen dann überlegt haben, wobei Willy gesagt
But Willy Brandt said,
aber du musst das Maul haben.
You have to shut up about this. We can't let anyone on the outside know that we have this dimension in mind. Otherwise they'll say, they're crazy and out of their league.
Das sind Verrückte. Die übernehmen sich.
Wenn man die berühmte Formel von Egon Bahr nimmt.
If you take Egon Bahr's famous formula, change through moving closer, this also meant, or implied, the possibility of a certain convergence.
Das heißt,
in other words, a successful Prague Spring.
Eine erfolgreiche Prager Frühling.
That socialism would become more humane.
Sozialismus
and that capitalism would also become more humane. And I think this conception also encouraged people like Gorbachev because they also believed that in their own way.
Ermuntert. Denn das glaubten sie auch auf ihre Weise. Das heißt auch in
That means that Ostpolitik, for all its illusions, was also helpful in that it nourished Gorbachev's useful illusions.
Diese nützliche Illusionen von Gorbachev.
Ostpolitik also means coming together on a personal level. This is openly demonstrated in the summer of 1971. Leonid Brezhnev and Willy Brandt show themselves to the watching world on a relaxed boat trip on the Black Sea. Both sides pursue different interests. The Soviet Union wants the confirmation of the post-war boundaries. German negotiator Egon Bahr wants humanitarian concessions, especially for the people of the GDR. The Eastern Treaties are signed, a successful balance of interests, even across ideological boundaries.
Die Ideologie war ein Punkt von
After his talks with Brezhnev, Brandt realized that in terms of ideology, you know, basically they're cynics.
Im Grunde sind das Zyniker. Also, sie glauben.
They're no longer true believers. But of course they use ideology as an instrument of power, domination and discipline.
Und Disziplinierungsinstrument.
In China, Mao Zedong enforces his personality cult. Mao's ambition makes China the Soviet Union's chief rival within the socialist bloc. Both sides accuse the other of betraying communism. At the river Ussuri on the Sino-Soviet border, the two socialist brother nations bear arms against each other.
Mao and the Chinese thought that they're bigger, and really, with their fresh revolutionary blood, they have to be the leader on the communist world. And I will repeat, communism at the time was only label. It was the fighting who will be leader in the third world.
While Mao's foreign policy was striving for the dominant role in the Third World, the Chinese Communist Party challenged him. He mobilizes the people against the Communist Party functionaries. His economic reforms failed.
Man muss es sich wie einen gigantischen Bürgerkrieg vorstellen.
You must think of it as a gigantic civil war. Of course, there were one or two show trials, but basically it was a widespread civil war with many smaller, horrible massacres and many minor trials. Not comparable to the trials under Stalin, and in a certain respect even more brutal than what happened in Moscow.
After Mao Zedong's death, another radical change occurs in China. Deng Xiaoping succeeds where Nikita Khrushchev failed after Stalin's death. By slowly introducing free enterprise zones, Deng is able to decentralize the economy on the model of the market economy. At the same time, the Communist Party holds on to its power.
I once told Deng Xiaoping, half seriously and half in jest, you call yourselves a communist party, but in reality, you're a party based on Confucius. We spoke English, and he said, so what? Meaning, he probably didn't really care.
In Western Europe, too, the communists turn away from the Soviet Union as a model. The Communist Party of Italy, under Enrico Berlinguer, is especially firm in stating its commitment to parliamentary democracy.
In some European societies, the communists naturally realized that they won't be successful if they are seen as fellow travelers or adjuncts of Moscow. And that's why they try to find a national direction that in a Western European society must naturally be different from the Soviet Empire.
Well, it was important to become more autonomous, more independent, to have one zone vision of democracy and socialism, and it was an implicit refusal of the dogmas of the Soviet Union and of the so-called real socialism.
France's communists under Georges Marchais continue to adhere to the dictatorship of the proletariat. The result, the French Communist Party becomes inconsequential.
We were convinced that the only possible consequence of detachment from the Soviet Union was to join social democracy.
Helsinki, August 1975. The Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, known by the abbreviation CSCE, this conference will change the world. Brezhnev has achieved a key post-1945 objective of Soviet foreign policy. All NATO member states recognize their post-war boundaries, at a price that seems not too high for him.
One intention of the Ostpolitik and Entente policy, and certainly not the least significant, was to create in the East and for the East some space to breathe and a little freedom to debate. That was accomplished by the Helsinki Final Act. This weakened the systems because suddenly everyone approved this whole package of declarations and things which were actually against their nature.
After years of preparation, 35 heads of state and government signed the CSCE Final Act. Its principle, recognition and security of borders in exchange for granting human rights. The treaty text must be printed in the newspapers of all signatory countries. This stipulation allows people everywhere to read the catalogue of rights that their countries had committed themselves to uphold.
This meant that the people could refer to these documents after they'd been printed in all the newspapers. All the dissident and civil rights movements are based on or really took off after Helsinki 1975.
Nach Helsinki 1975.
Zu den Dissidenten würde ich erstmal sagen, dass sie in den 70ern.
Regarding the dissidents, I would first of all say that the analysis they made in the 1970s was accurate, which assumed that communism cannot be reformed from above, but can only be destroyed from below, destroyed through peaceful evolution.
All over the East Bloc, people make lively use of the new rights granted to them in the Helsinki Final Act. In Czechoslovakia, a group of dissenters surrounding Jerzy Hayek and Václav Havel signed the Charter 77, which makes their demands public. The reaction of communist powers that be is repression. The number of political prisoners rises. After Helsinki, the public observes very carefully how the state apparatus treats dissidents. Arrests and exile no longer go without notice, especially of internationally known civil rights activists. The KGB attempts to isolate the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Andrei Sakharov from the outside world. Author Alexander Solzhenitsyn is expelled from the Soviet Union. Public criticism of the system is not allowed under Brezhnev.
Among themselves, Russians call this time the Leaden Years. But it was a time when even the average Russian enjoyed a certain modest wealth, able to enjoy such fruits of civilization as a refrigerator, radio, television, maybe even a car. But at the end of the Brezhnev period, the demise was hard not to notice. The system doesn't work if it no longer provides these modest luxury items. And then there is Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, 1979. When the communist regime threatens to collapse, Soviet tanks once again roll in. The invasion of the Soviet army is condemned all over the world as an act of aggression. There's renewed confrontation between East and West. The enormous costs incurred by the war ruin the Soviet economy.
The Americans under Carter began to develop about 12 new military technologies. And we reacted with our own programs. Then the healthcare budget was cut by 40%. Expenditures for culture, schools and so on by 30%. That's when the agony of society and the state began.
Standing in line becomes a full-time occupation. Even the most basic supplies are a problem. Empty shelves everywhere. The economy of scarcity paralyzes the entire Eastern Bloc. While the computer sets off the third industrial revolution in the West, the Soviet leadership tries to cut the country off from any external influence.
They complained back then, saying that in the West, any 15-year-old could play with a computer, while they had a few specialists who, after many exams, would maybe come into contact with the machines when they are 20 or 25. The natural integration of the computer into daily life, not to mention the military, as in the West, didn't exist with them, and also couldn't exist because it demanded a spirit of freedom.
A modern society, and Russian society was eventually a modern society, does not let itself be dictated to all the time. Reglementation and dictating were the essence of Brezhnevism.
In the late 1970s, there is resistance in Poland against the government. Workers go on strike.
The resistance had a lot to do with the strong position of the Catholic Church in Poland, and also with the distinctive feature that the Poles had a bishop who'd been elected Pope.
In 1979, Pope John Paul II visits his home country. Everywhere he goes, he's greeted by enthusiastic crowds.
Ohne polnischer Papst, kein Gorbatschow.
No Polish Pope, no Gorbachev. No Velvet Revolution in 1989. To be sure, without the Pope and his visit to Poland in 1979, the shattering of the regime and the experience of solidarity that led to Solidarność wouldn't have happened.
Kein Solidarność zustande gekommen wäre.
The Pope's visit inspires a new opposition movement. The workers of the Lenin docks in Gdańsk initiate independent unions which join together as Solidarność under the leadership of Lech Wałęsa. The individual voices of dissident groups claiming the rights granted by Helsinki become a mass movement struggling for self-determination.
Ohne Solidarność, kein Gorbatschow.
Without Solidarność, no Gorbachev. Since the premise of Gorbachev's European policy was, it can't go on like this in Eastern Europe. We have to change something fundamentally in Eastern Europe.
Mikhail Gorbachev becomes a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He is not yet 50. 1982, the parade commemorating the 65th anniversary of the revolution. Gorbachev is by far the youngest among the otherwise grey functionaries. Marked by age and grave illness, head of state and general secretary of the CPSU, Leonid Brezhnev, who dies shortly afterwards. Within the next 3 years, his two successors also die, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. The election of 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary seems liberating. Gorbachev, the son of a harvest vehicle driver, studied law in Moscow. On his way to the May Day parade with his family, Mikhail Gorbachev is now the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. People put their hopes in him.
Bei meinem ersten Gespräch mit Gorbatschow kam
In my first talk with Gorbachev, he brought up the point, the idea of communism must be freed of the old baggage that is Stalin's legacy, freed of the crimes committed in the structures that Stalin had set up. Then Lenin's old ideas would once again seem highly attractive. There's no doubt that Gorbachev wanted to revive ideal communism the way that Lenin had originally planned it, and Gorbachev thought he was able to.
Gorbatschow war doch innerlich ein Mann.
Deep inside Gorbachev was a man of the Prague Spring. He believed in socialism with a human face. He believed that communism could be reformed. And without this illusion, he would surely have not gone as far as he did. The hounding of dissidents was over. Send 2 electricians to Sakharov on December the 15th, 1987. They'll install a telephone and say, tomorrow you'll receive a call. Yes, and then he does receive a call. And it's Gorbachev saying, I want to apologize for the previous leadership, and you can return to Moscow tomorrow.
Through Sakharov's release and that of other political prisoners, Gorbachev scores points with many at home and abroad. Camps for political prisoners are closed. A few, like Perm 36, become memorials. The style of politics also changes. Gorbachev seeks direct contact with the people. On the streets, he campaigns for his policies.
I believe that no system transformation in the whole history of mankind is comparable to that of the Soviet Union. With its 240 million inhabitants back then, it was one of the biggest countries in the world. In the mid-1980s, Gorbachev was faced by the challenge of changing both the economic and political systems. The challenge of introducing free elections.
February 1986, the 27th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev makes a spectacular appearance. Glasnost and Perestroika are his slogans, transparency and change. The party delegates are enthralled. A feeling of optimism is in the air.
At that time, I think that Gorbachev was the best for us. He finished the Cold War. He reduced the nuclear threat to all the people. With his cooperation with very opposite person. It was the last Bolshevik in the 20th century, President Reagan, who wanted this, did the same. Even he was really very ideologically motivated anti-communism.
Was Reagan angeht,
as for Reagan, he was a hardline anti-communist. Hard, of course, in that he thought, we've not only the responsibility, but also the opportunity to force the Soviet Union into a corner and into an arms race, so that it starts to squeak.
Die Sowjetunion so in die Ecke drängen und in die Ecke rüsten, dass sie anfängt zu quietschen. Das hat auch gemacht.
And that's what he did. But he was smart enough to talk like a Cold War warrior,
wie ein kalter Krieger zu reden und wie ein Entspannungspolitiker zu entscheiden.
But to make decisions like a politician supporting Entente.
Das heißt, Reykjavik
was the turning point in relations between Washington and Moscow.
In der Beziehung zwischen Washington und Moskau.
Enthusiastically and quickly, Gorbachev advances his foreign policy. In 1986, there's a decisive meeting with US President Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik. One of the Soviet government's main problems is the murderous pressure by America to modernize. After years of the arms race, serious arms reduction talks begin. Reykjavik is just the beginning of Gorbachev's vigorous travel diplomacy. He's a virtuoso on the international stage, especially the UN. With a package of arms reduction proposals, he forces the US president's hand. But Mikhail Gorbachev is under pressure himself. He must clean up his government's budget by eliminating the crushing arms and war expenditures.
Yeah, Afghanistan.
Yes. Afghanistan. Since 1979, Soviet troops had been involved in an unjustifiable war of aggression by occupying Afghanistan. And there are Gorbachev's words that still echo today. Afghanistan is a bleeding wound, meaning that the Secretary-General is saying what my predecessors did basically betrayed the Soviet people and the idea of communism and led to a terrible defeat. Gorbachev said in 1988, "Enough with Afghanistan, the troops are coming home."
Images of returning troops boost Gorbachev's reputation at home and abroad.
Innenpolitisch hat versagt.
He failed in terms of domestic policy.
Versagen müssen, denke ich.
He had to. Because there's no textbook on how to turn an unwieldy state-run economy into a social market economy.
Aus einer gelenkten Staatswirtschaft eine soziale Marktwirtschaft macht.
Soon we realized that the man had no system, no program. His thesis was, attack first and look around later. And then he said, that's what Lenin once said. A minor mix-up. Lenin didn't say that. Napoleon did.
In the late 1980s, Gorbachev invited me for talks. I told him that he had to be careful with his monetary policy and with increasing the volume of money. I quoted to him the figures on the Soviet money volume for 1 year and the following year. And he said, "Oh, Comrade Schmidt, we never really kept track of that in Moscow," which was pure nonsense. I suddenly realized that he was simply incapable of understanding certain problems.
I think his intentions were very good, but he wasn't a real strong, firm reformer, let's say like Deng Xiaoping.
How he abolished the command economy without a worry and ruined our economy once and for all. How he sold our gold reserves, and at the end of his administration, we were practically out of gold reserves and so on.
The man in the Kremlin is increasingly under fire. People are protesting in the streets. Some demand even faster implementation of reforms. Others the return to the old order. Miners strike for unpaid wages, but also for their democratic rights.
For the Soviet Union, for Russia, the Gorbachev is a destructive person.
He is a virtuoso, an actor. Everyone thought that he was very capable of adapting. He could play both comedy and tragedy.
I cannot say when Gorbachev came to the conclusion that Lenin also had to be abolished. Gorbachev, as someone shaped by the KGB, believed what the KGB report said. Everyone was a smiling Soviet personality. Everyone believed in the Soviet ideal, and that nations are simply fairy tales. He really believed that. But the moment he meant democracy seriously, and he did mean it seriously, we need democracy like the air that we breathe. I read that myself in Moscow during Gorbachev's early years. He underestimated that democracy can also be very highly explosive in combination with nationalism.
Wir brauchen Demokratie wie die Luft zum Atmen.
We need democracy like the air that we breathe.
Darauf habe ich zu Willi gesagt, hör mal.
I said to Willi, listen, the old conflict is over. Not the dictatorship of the proletariat, but democracy like the air that we breathe. meaning the leader of the communists accepts the basic understanding of social democracy. That also means losing power. And Willy replied, "Shut up. We don't want to give the boy more problems than he already has."
In 1988, Gorbachev abandons the Brezhnev Doctrine. This means the Soviet Union waives its prerogative to intervene in all socialist countries. A few months later, there are velvet revolutions in most East Bloc countries. Communist governments are toppled non-violently almost everywhere. It's the end of the Soviet Empire. On October the 7th, 1989, the GDR celebrates the 40th anniversary of its founding. Guest of honor, Soviet Party head Mikhail Gorbachev. The GDR leadership clings to old rituals. But on the streets, protest is forming. Here too, Gorbachev is a beacon of hope.
I can't say that I felt any different from the rest of the country, or the rest of the world. On that famous afternoon of November the 9th, 1989, I went home because there was nothing going on in the German parliament, a boring agenda. And I was surprised when I turned on the television and saw people dancing on the wall. And then the phone rang. It was Willy calling from the parliament, asking, "Do you know what's going on?" Yes. Surprised, aren't you? Yes. You'd never have thought it, huh? No.
A month later, the Berlin Wall falls.
Gorbachev didn't want to give up his communist empire. He wasn't a traitor. Gorbachev was a communist. But he didn't have a real, effective concept to reform communism. That's why he was the besieged king who opened the gates for the enemy himself. You have to hand it to him. He was different from Peter the Great, different from Lenin, different from Stalin. He wasn't a ruthless person, and that's why Mikhail Gorbachev probably prevented millions of deaths. One should be grateful. A great statesman he wasn't.
Dafür muss man ihm dankbar sein, aber ein großer Staatsmann war er nicht.
I think our attitude towards Gorbachev was ambiguous. On the one hand, we fought him and tried to bring him to his senses, and on the other hand, we still believed in him. We paid a high price for that, especially our fatherland.
Of course, he was not a great statesman. You cannot say that he is a great statesman who destroyed his own country. He is a tragic figure. But if you look in that period when the country and their mood come so close to the revolution, it's difficult to say who can make it different.
The Russian state could remain powerful or omnipotent only as long as the population identified with the state and its values. As soon as the population turns away from these values or its own state, it collapses like a house of cards. That was the case in 1917, and it was the case in 1991.
Moscow, August the 19th, 1991. Tanks roll through the streets. Members of the Secret Service and old communist functionaries attempt a coup against Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin, the first freely elected president of Russia, calls the people to resistance. The coup fails. General Secretary Gorbachev has been saved, but it's Boris Yeltsin who now calls the shots. One day after the failed putsch, the Ukraine declares secession from the Soviet Union. The other republics follow. The Soviet Union is dissolving.
Вот Борис Николаевич мне сейчас, когда уже мы встретились, Он дал краткое изложение заседания Кабинета министров, но я его еще не читал. Вот записать.
On December the 25th, 1991, Gorbachev holds a television address to declare his resignation as the last communist leader of the Soviet Union. The great socialist experiment that began in 1917 with Lenin has failed. The red flag waving over the Kremlin is taken down. Has capitalism won for good, or does communism still have a future?
The essential question is, A. Can capitalism be reformed after its opponent has proven incapable of reform? And the second question is, considering the fact that we're in the middle of a development affecting all industrial societies, where machines need fewer and fewer people to produce more and more, how can we escape this situation without damaging or destroying the system?
Ohne dass das System Schaden leidet oder zusammenbricht.
The eternal victory of capitalism, I don't believe in that. But I also don't believe that such an absurd, inhumane doctrine like communism will ever make a comeback.
Ich glaube, die entscheidende Herausforderung.
I believe that the decisive next challenge will be to politically tame this incredibly dynamic economic system.
Politisch zu zähmen.
Also der alte Kommunismus wird nicht wiederkommen.
The old form of communism won't return, but the idea that the British parliamentary system will migrate all over the world, for that, the socio-economic conflicts are much too brutal and much too tough.
Sozialökonomischen Konflikte viel zu brutal und viel zu hart.
Communism is simply the vision, the idea, but also the goal that people do not have to be eternally subjected to the savage law of competition.
The communist system, as it was introduced in stages to Russia in 1917, has discredited itself and has no future.
The lessons of history were so tough, I think that nobody can insist on those positions, on those illusions. I don't see any future for communism as an ideology which can represent the basis for social and political significant movements, particularly in Europe.
But the idea of the equality of the people will exist in our soul all the time.
The idea of equality didn't come from the communists, but from the French Revolution. That was over 200 years ago. The idea of equality will always fascinate people. But if they consider themselves communists because of that, that's another question entirely.